In this tutorial, I'll demonstrate how to create a weblog with user commenting, and even with explaining everything clearly, it should only take about 20 minutes. This tutorial uses the assets that were created in the introductory tutorial, so if you haven't watched that yet, it would be good to do so. The first thing I have to do is create a database. So I'll use a desktop application to accomplish this, but you can use phpMyAdmin, the command line, or whatever your preferred utility is for database management. I'll create a database and name it blog, and I'll add a table and name it entries. Our ID field, I want to change the type to auto increment so that it will increment with each entry. We also need to add a title field. And we need a content field for the weblog entry information. I'll call this field body and make it of the text type. Now, if I were doing this for a real site, I'd probably add a date field, an author field, and a few other things, but for this demonstration, I'll keep it simple with just a title and a body field. So now we need to tell Codeigniter to connect to the database we just created. To do that, I'll go to the config folder and open our database file. Within this file, it allows us to store our database connectivity settings. You'll see in the array a host name, username, password, and database. Now, the database we just created is blog, so I'll key this in here and save it. Now, we've saved that setting in the file, but Codeigniter will not automatically connect to our database. It doesn't assume that you necessarily need database access, so we need to tell it that we do by making use of the autoload file, also in the config folder. This file lets us specify classes, helper files, plugins, and other resources that we want loaded automatically every time the system runs. So I'll open the file, and within the core array, I'll add database since it happens to be a core library. Now if we go to our front controller, index.php, the fact that I'm not seeing an error message tells me that we've successfully connected to our database. Obviously, we're still seeing the information that we generated during our introductory tutorial, the to-do list that we created, but in a moment I'll replace this with our actual blog information. What I want to do first, though, is to add some information to the database so we have some data to work with. To do that, I'd like to use the scaffolding feature. Codeigniter has a scaffolding feature that makes it very convenient to add information to your database. So let's go to the controller that we created last time, and within the constructor, I'll load the scaffolding feature. And we need to tell it the database table that we want to scaffold, and since our table was called entries, I'll use that as the parameter. Before we can actually use our scaffolding feature, we need to go back to our config folder and open the routes file. You'll recall that this is where we set our default controller in the first tutorial. It also lets us set a secret word that will trigger the scaffolding feature for added security. I'll just use scaffolding here. Now that that's set and we have our scaffolding feature loaded into our blog controller, I'll go to my web browser and I'll type blog scaffolding. Blog, of course, is the name of our class, and scaffolding is the trigger word we just set in the routes file. And you can see our scaffolding utility is now being shown. I'll use it to create a new weblog entry.